This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 356, side 1, September 29th, 1978. For the next 2 or 3 weeks, possibly 4, I will be discussing the House Select Committee on Assassinations on these tapes with you, and hopefully you will make copies of these tapes and send them to various members of the committee. I don't have the money to spare for extra copies, but if you are so inclined and want to send letters to them and transcribe some of the things I've said and write to them and write to the Justice Department to demand an investigation of this House Select Committee, I would appreciate that. And I think that you can also take advantage of talk shows on the radio. I hear Bob Trevor at various times on the evening on KGO here in California. He reaches all the western states, about 30 states, and sometimes he'll say the board is empty, there's no calls. Why aren't people calling in? And, of course, I am on that station a lot with Bob, but you could still utilize across the country in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania. I know wherever these tapes are going, there are talk shows in those cities, and I don't think you people are using this enough to call in and express your anger and outrage. And I'm going to run down the things that I have observed about the House Select Committee through their 17 days of open hearings and testimony. And you'll get these tapes, and I hope that you use them and don't just sit on them, because the purpose of doing this work is to expose these people and then to do something about it. Just before I get into the tapes, I do want to tell you I got a copy of the new People's Almanac. I don't know how many of you ever read the first People's Almanac put out by David Walshinsky and Irving Wallace. That's Wallace's son. It was on the bestseller list for over a year, and it's in paperback. It's a fantastic book. I love the first one, and they asked me to do a section for the second People's Almanac, which I might have mentioned on my tapes this last year that I was working on. It's called The Last Words of Lee Harvey Oswald, and they just, pardon me, got something in my throat. They just sent me an autographed copy of the new People's Almanac number 2, and I've got 6 pages in there. The Last Words of Oswald, compiled by Mae Brussell. And the introduction goes on to say that everybody has talked about Lee Harvey Oswald except himself, and that the editors of People's Almanac wanted me to compile what Lee Harvey Oswald said from the time that he was arrested until he was killed. He was kept in the custody of the Dallas Police Department. There were no tape recordings there or secretaries to transcribe what he said. So the information that I got and compiled in chronological order was taken from him in front of newsmen, in front of various policemen, his wife, what his brother said, what his mother said, what the people said who arrested him that were in the car taking him to the Dallas jail, persons who testified before the Warren Commission who heard Oswald in the corridors and at the press conference, and compiling it in chronological order. I think you'll find it really interesting, and I'm very excited about it because it tells its own story, and this is important to keep the history straight about what Lee Harvey Oswald said about himself, and then compare it to the evidence that's come out since and see if the House Select Committee even examined the allegations that he said or went into them, which they didn't, which is negligence because he was alive and made these claims, and they should have gone into these matters. That is the People's Almanac, volume number 2. I guess it's on the stands now, or should be, and it's put out by Bantam Books. It's a paper-bound, and it's $9.95. I've given you on this sheet that accompanies the tape the names of the persons who carried the radio conversation in between the House Select hearing committees. I think they are very important, and to transcribe the exact hearings or to get the verbatim testimony when it comes out from the government printing office isn't enough, because Nina Totenberg and Joe Volsch introduced in the morning who the witnesses were. They came on after the hearings and gave their interpretation of what was said. They came on before the next witnesses after the lunch break and reiterated what they thought took place, and then they summarized in the evening what transpired in the room. And they were abysmal failures, and I think that Joe Volsch was just absolutely impossibly determined to show that Oswald was involved in some kind of a conspiracy, or Fidel Castro was. And they were uneducated into any of the circumstances of the assassinations. They had a printed sheet out that the House Select Committee gave them to read on the air of the press coverage, and that's what they read, and didn't do any homework on their own. And I have their addresses if you want to write and complain, because they'll be on again during the Martin Luther King hearings in November. And I think you just might as well tell them what kind of asses they are, that they're total fools and asses, and listen yourself to what they say, and if you don't get these programs in your own hometowns, I'm sorry, this isn't going on national television like they promised, and many people aren't getting these hearings. So the summary I give you will be my view of what transpired until you can buy the actual volumes of testimony yourself. They even hinted that they may lock up this report. The House of Representatives, headed by Representative Pike, did an investigation into domestic intelligence activities. That's the one that Daniel Shore leaked to Rolling Stones, and the entire report, if you don't take the Rolling Stones, is locked up and has not been available. Very important links of the beginning of the Central Intelligence Agency to the Dewey campaign in New York and the beginning of organized crime in those agencies, but that is locked up, and they hinted that even this may be locked up. If we don't make a fuss about the House Select Committee and their working, the way they're working now, and let them continue, it will just double the connivery that they're into, and if we make too much fuss, they'll lock the information up. So either way, we're kind of damned, but the truth will come out, and I think that the evidence here of their manipulations is so flagrant that it'll be a whole new source of young investigators to continue on. After the first Warren Commission assault upon truth, we now have this $6 million fiasco. So write to Joe Volz and Nina Totenberg. I have her phone number, and I don't have his, and you can express your opinions. I also have given you a list of the members of the House Select Committee. You can write to all of them, photocopy one letter and send it to each one of them with their name on, or you can write to them individually and express your feelings about this matter. If you have any feelings, just sit down and take the time and do it. It would be appreciated by the researchers who've done so much work. And again, there is a determined effort of a handful of people in this country to set the record straight about the truth. And then there are a lot of people who subscribe to these tapes or buy the books and exposés who just sit back and hope that somebody else will do the work for them. It's not going to happen that way, so just get your own wrist moving and your own paper and pencil and express some of your feelings to this stupid bunch of fools. I don't know where they find these people. I really do not know. As I said here, they're incompetent, uninformed, ignorant to the material available, and on public radio you can hear just how bad they are, and I hope the documents come out so you can read their questions for yourself and not just take my word for it. I think the original critics were right to question the government. I'm proud that I'm among the first 11 in the United States that began my research in November 1963. November 24th I began, when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot. And it was J. Lee Rankin, the Solicitor General to the United States, who was General Counsel of the Warren Commission, who testified before the House Select Committee, and he said, in quotes, "I'm disappointed about some of the things. I am shocked, very much disappointed about some of the things that have been revealed in recent years." And he admitted that there were things that he didn't know at the time. He isn't vindicated, and he's a liar, and there's documents to show that he was part of the cover-up from the very first day. But now he's saying that information was withheld from them, and he's very disappointed. The fact that we researchers just plowed in and indicated that there were cover-ups and actually forced these people to even to be in a position to say that they were unaware of the shenanigans of J. Edgar Hoover or Allen Dulles is a big admission, just to squeeze that out of them, because just by instinct or whatever you might want to call it, in 1963, there were a handful of us that didn't trust J. Edgar Hoover or Allen Dulles at the time. Nicholas Katzenbach, who was Deputy Attorney General under the Director of the Justice Department, Robert Kennedy, said before the committee, in quotes, "I'm astounded to this day that the former director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, who served on the Warren Commission, didn't at least tell the other commission members of the plot to kill Fidel Castro. Perhaps naively, I thought the appointment of Allen Dulles would ensure that the commission would be told of everything the CIA had in its files." That is Nicholas Katzenbach, now attorney for IBM, that has been a conduit of CIA agents overseas. It was Nicholas Katzenbach who, according to the minutes of the Warren Commission meetings, was ordered by Earl Warren to destroy the body of Lee Harvey Oswald because there was something on that body and the nation couldn't stand another shock. And the orders were to go to Katzenbach, according to the meetings, the minutes of the meetings, January 21st, 1964, before the first witnesses were called. So it's disgusting to call Nicholas Katzenbach in 1978 and have him on the stand and not ask him about the cremation of the remains of A. Lee Harvey Oswald, particularly since there were allegations that there were doubles. But they let him on the stand to talk about Allen Dulles being remiss in assisting the original Warren Commission, and they let J. Lee Rankin get on the stand to say that J. Edgar Hoover had held back information from them, making Hoover and Dulles the patsies for the upsurge of a large body of critics that came later, and they, under oath, say that they're shocked and surprised while all the documents and evidence and the questioning of the witnesses before the Warren Commission shows that J. Lee Rankin was part of this conspiracy from the day that he was assigned to the job. Now, the Warren Commission began with their FBI report that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty, and the original Warren report had a problem. They had to put all the evidence that the FBI collected, and the FBI was the source of the collection of evidence for the Warren Commission, taking it from the Secret Service or the CIA or the Dallas Police Department or the State Department. The FBI collected information and gave it to the Warren Commission. And the FBI had printed a report within 2 days saying that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty. And the Warren Commission's problem in 1964 was to take all the evidence that would come in until the Warren report was published and try to put that into the bag that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty. Now, whatever they could distort and put in through perjured testimony and lack of cross-examination, manipulation of physical evidence, they put in. When they had evidence that there was a conspiracy, they just simply ignored it and published it because, as I said on one of the tapes, according to the minutes of the Warren Commission meeting, Allen Dulles said, we may as well print all the evidence because nobody will read it anyway, and if we don't print it, they'll think we covered something up, and that's how we got the 26 volumes. Well, what didn't fit into the Warren Commission conclusions that was bound in one book, they tried to ignore, like you put dirt under the rug when company is coming, or dirty clothes you quick throw into the laundry basket and let them rot and accumulate if you have house guests instead of washing them, or aged food in the icebox that you think it's in the icebox, nobody will see it, and it's decaying and smelling. So all of the report, or the turds of the evidence, I call them turds, that began to stink, the evidence, the actual pieces of information of the conspiracy were bound within the 26 volumes and have been there all along. And they've been ignored, and the Warren Commission just stayed with the story that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone and ignored that body of evidence. Now along comes Mr. Blakey, who has a tough job. He's been assigned to cover up for one more time the actual evidence of the conspiracy. New Times Magazine has a description of Robert Blakey, this was September 4th, 1978, describing him as being on the LEAA, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, and he began approving of wiretapping, electronic surveillance. He worked with Richard Nixon setting up the Senate Bill 1, that terrible police state document that was pushed aside, and then a substitute bill was put in, and now they're pushing it aside for another substitute. He worked on his commissions with 4 people from the actual original Warren Commission: Leon Jaworski, Robert G. Story, Lewis F. Powell, and Nicholas Katzenbach. He knew them intimately, and he also was a defense witness for modalities of organized crime when La Costa was suing, and has sued Penthouse Magazine for allegations that crime members are involved in that resort down in San Diego. Modalities, of course, shared housing and intimate contacts with Robert Mayhew, and I've mentioned this, I believe, on other tapes. I don't have to go into William Blakey more, but Chief Counsel G. Robert Blakey had the job now to clean up the other pieces that were left from the original Warren Commission. The Rockefeller Committee was formed to look into domestic CIA activities and assassination plots. They folded quickly when they found too many conspiracies. The job was handed like a hot potato to Representative Pike and the House Committee at the Pike Report, and they closed house fast. Senator Church continued the game, and in came Robert Blakey to cover up, because Senator Church closed his investigation. He said, I'm running for president, I have to stop. And he stopped fast. It was in the spring of '76. And Robert Blakey, I believe, was not just replacing Mr. Richard Sprague as the head of this committee, but that they had him like in the sidelines, like an actress waits as a backup part, to come in and take over the committee when it was necessary, and they could pull out Mr. Sprague, and who wanted a 5-year investigation and a complete investigation, Mr. Richard A. Sprague, and they pulled him from the committee and handed it to Robert Blakey. Now, the goal of this committee, of Robert Blakey's, the game plan, is a little bit different than the original Warren report, of course. That was to fit all the evidence into the way that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy and killed Officer J.D. Tippit, and Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald for no motive except that he wanted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of a trial. The goal and game plan of Robert Blakey was this. Number one, to pull enough scientific evidence to support the original Warren report conclusions, even though he would use NASA and the defense industry agencies that are suspect in the crimes, and we'll go into those later. I want to give you the specific goals that this game plan has used. One, use scientific evidence to support the original Warren report conclusions. Two, silence the critics of the Warren Commission. Show once and for all that they were misled or unpatriotic or didn't use all the evidence. Three, turn the Gallup poll around. It's necessary to turn the Gallup poll around. 80% of the people in the United States no longer trust the Warren report, and their goal, according to Mr. Richardson Pryor on Face the Nation, and according to the moderators, I've given you their names in between the programs, they keep saying this will turn the critics around. The figure they've settled on is that 80% of the country didn't believe the Warren report by 1978, but 80% of the reasonable people in the country will believe it when they're done. The fourth goal of this committee is to put the blame of the critics for being misdirected on two major pieces of evidence. One, a memo that allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald, a letter Lee Harvey Oswald brought to FBI agent James Hosty in the Dallas area prior to the assassination. And the second piece of evidence would be the fact that Allen Dulles did not tell the Warren Commission that the CIA had wanted to kill Fidel Castro. They have turned this around, that these are important pieces of evidence, and later I'll go into detail about those. The Hosty memo would indicate that Lee Harvey Oswald had the potential for violence, and that they didn't know that in advance, and that if the CIA wanted to kill Fidel Castro, and if he knew about it, the motive could have been vengeance against John Kennedy, and I'll go into more detail about that now. But the fifth conclusion or goal of this game plan of Mr. Blakey is that we now have all the facts available that will come to us unless the KGB turns over their files, that we can't look any further. We did all there was to do, and this is the game plan of Robert Blakey and the Congressional Committee this time around. As I said before, once, to use new scientific evidence to support the original Warren report conclusions. Two, silence the critics of the Warren Commission. Three, turn the Gallup polls around so the Americans believe in their institutions, their federal institutions. Four, put the blame of the crop of critics on some misdirected information that J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles held back. And five, to allege that there is no more to know. We've done the best we can. We've spent a year, $6 million, and the best investigators available, the best objective minds, and this is the only chance we'll have to know the truth. Now, in order to make that game plan work, and as I say, we'll later go into these point by point, they had to come up with new methods to operate. They have a lot of critics around now, hundreds and thousands, not 100,000, but hundreds of them, or maybe into the thousands. So they have to come up with a new way of working or a new game plan using some of the ways the Warren Commission worked, adding new tricks, ignoring even the own facts that are the facts that are presented to them, and passing over their own experts. This is the way they could manipulate the story now that there are no Lee Harvey Oswald doubles, and the picture of Oswald in the backyard was indeed taken by Marina. And I'll go into the items that they covered. These were the techniques. Some of the same methods that they used as the Warren Commission included secrecy. They had total secrecy until 17 days of open hearings. There was 1 year of secrecy. They used no critics of the findings of the police or the FBI at the time. Now, the minutes of the Warren Commission have statements that Mark Lane was looking at information about conspiracy. Joe Jostin was writing a book and had facts. Thomas Buchanan was in Paris, was doing a book on the Kennedy conspiracy. They knew that critics were coming along, and they had minutes of the meetings. How will we handle these critics? Well, they decided the way to handle the critics was to call the president of the Associated Press and the president of the United Press to put the critics down. So when the original Warren Commission was done doing their work, they didn't call in the early critics who were investigating material evidence at the time that they were investigating it and compiled their information. If they'd taken the original allegations of Joe Jostin and Mark Lane, and Mark Lane's work was good at that time, his statements in Rush to Judgment at that time were good, and Buchanan's book on Who Killed Kennedy, if they called them in and said, what do you know that the FBI doesn't know, they would have come to different conclusions. But this committee didn't call in the new batch of critics or use the information of the old critics. They worked in secrecy. The major witnesses that could be called were not called before this committee, and they're still alive. There's many that died, but there's some that are still alive, and I'll run down some of those names later. They asked the wrong question of the witnesses on the stand. When they had the right witness on, they asked the wrong question. They changed the subject just as the Warren Commission went off the record. These people just changed the subject if the witness was capable of having information, such as Cyril Weck, an example, was on the stand saying, why do you accept this lone bullet theory? It doesn't hold up scientifically. There was a coup d'etat in this country. They went on to the next question, and even though there was a historian on that committee, a history professor, Representative Floyd Fithian, he never said, what is a coup d'etat? He didn't ask about that, and they just ignored that totally. They didn't want to know what Cyril Weck meant, even though he's a graduate doctor and a lawyer and a responsible member of the community, scientific community and legal community. They ignored that kind of questioning, and they changed the subject. They accepted perjury, 2 different stories from witnesses, 180-degree differences in what happened, and nobody will be prosecuted. They never accounted for evidence that was missing. They came to conclusions without going into evidence that was missing. Specifically, one of the gross pieces of evidence was the testing of the bullet fragments from the wrist of John Conley, and the fragments found in the car of John Kennedy and John Conley, and trying to put them into that neat, pristine bullet 399. And after they did their lengthy neutron activation test, they were told that J. Edgar Hoover did neutron activation tests of bullet fragments in 1964 that were not only not conclusive, but they were different bullets than these bullets. So they didn't account for missing bullets that would add up more and change the picture. Their questions were all made out in advance, so they couldn't ask anything that wasn't on the list. Therefore, there couldn't be a spontaneous question if a witness came out with a hint of something. Time limits were imposed on their questioning and on the days that they would hear testimony, so they couldn't go into detail. They were not equipped to ask intelligent questions of these particular agents, or were not allowed to, or not prepared to. They hadn't done their homework. And there was no examination of anybody on the stand. I heard between the programs, whether it was Nina or Joe or one of the members of the committee, saying that they used cross-examination. Cross-examination would be to allow members of the AIB who were in the audience or critics of the Warren Commission report who had studied certain witnesses that were on the stand and allow them to ask questions of these witnesses that either they would be held for perjury or give new light to the information. These methods the Warren Commission used, these are the methods the House Select Committee used. Their secrecy, not calling the right people, asking the wrong questions, changing the subject, accepting perjury, not accounting for evidence missing, questions made out in advance, a time limit imposed, no background to ask intelligent questions, no cross-examination by any of the witnesses, by any of the critics to the witnesses. Then they came up with some techniques that were even better than the original Warren Commission. The Warren Commission just planted all its evidence and testimony and let you untangle it for 15 years at your own time and expense. But in order to come up to the conclusions that they're coming up with, and they're writing their report now, they had to alter a lot of evidence, and of course I've taken massive notes of the incidences where they altered evidence, but the ones that come to my mind now were they had to change the firing time of Lee Harvey Oswald from 2.3 seconds to 1.6. They did away with the fact that there was a scope on the rifle and said he used his bare eye. I don't know by what insight they got that story now, that they could come to that conclusion that the Warren Commission didn't consider it before, particularly since there was somebody at the rifle range asking for a gun with a scope on that was a double of Lee Harvey Oswald's. It wasn't, not the rifle range, at the gun shop of Mr. Ryder, asking specifically for a scope. There was a man, allegedly Oswald, but Oswald was in Mexico at the time, talking about telescopic scopes out at the rifle range. A rifle was ordered specifically with a scope on it, but they came to the conclusion that the FBI's efforts in 1964 were wrong, that they could shoot in 1.6 seconds. They also could determine the trajectory by going backwards from the hole in the body up to the buildings, even though one of the experts said that that was impossible and that would be way off, even though they're going to use his name on the final report, and we'll go into that later. They could suddenly take the bullet from the back backwards up to the building and come with these figures. They didn't bother to go into the trajectory of the wrist or the thigh of John Connally. They sort of stopped with the chest, going through John Kennedy's back and coming out his throat, into Connally's back and coming out his chest. And they didn't follow the flight pattern all the way from the thigh to the stretcher in the Parkland Hospital. They also still didn't locate the source of bullet 399. They called in these great scientific experts to put all of these matters to rest, and as I say, I'll go into details in each one of these things, but they never bothered to explain that there was no blood on the pristine bullet, that the bullets tested by the neutron activation test were different bullets than the ones tested in 1964, and therefore there are still more particles, and they never attested to the fact that this bullet that was found was on the stretcher of John Connally, was in fact on it. They also had witnesses who testified here before this committee, as they did it before the Warren Commission, that came up with some facts, but that really panicked them, and they didn't know how to handle that. They ignored the testimony of a witness that the bullets that were in Officer Tippett didn't match the pistol that Lee Harvey Oswald was possessing when he was arrested at the theater in Texas. There was this quick running over of this testimony that those bullets didn't match, those fragments. They had a witness who testified that the shots could come from an area from the Daltex building or the roof of the Texas School Book Depository or the 5th floor, but they ignored that and pinpointed it to the lair of Lee Harvey Oswald up at the 6th floor window, even though the range could include the Daltex building, and he was asked that question and said yes, it could include that building. They didn't go into the evidence that the gun order from Klein's in Chicago for the rifle of Lee Harvey Oswald could be planted or forged, even though their handwriting witness stated specifically that you can't make a firm handwriting conclusion from a photographed document if you don't have the original source. And they pulled out an original source of Lee Harvey Oswald purchasing some ammunition, but the gun order from Klein's was not hard evidence, and they said that right from the beginning, but they'll come to the conclusion that that was, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald's gun. And passed over the handwriting experts who were on the stand. They had a man proving that there was no double of Lee Harvey Oswald, that he was in the Marines. His handwriting was on a Marine application form, that he applied for a job in Dallas area, that he applied for a passport, that he had arrest records in New Orleans and arrested in Dallas. But they never pulled out the diary of Lee Harvey Oswald, and they never tested Marina Oswald's handwriting for the name Fidel, which she did in fact use, and which was the name on the gun that was ordered in Chicago. They also called what they called objective scientists, as objective as the original Warren Commission. This time they brought in NASA and the space engineering scientists and the Army scientists, and they announced that the scientists were all objective, and they had no particular interest. Of course, they hinted in covering up that they'd use the best objective scientists they could use. Yet one of the gentlemen talking about the bullets and the bullet tests that went through John Kennedy's body and John Connally's body said that when he was through, he wanted to thank the Army for giving him time off to testify. And he, in fact, was the same person who worked on the bullet test for the Warren Commission in 1964. The NASA and space engineering tests of these bullets really are difficult to evaluate, because the Defense Industry Security Command in NASA have been charged with being part of the conspiracy to kill John Kennedy by various researchers, and the links have never been discounted. They've been ignored and never been disproven, and the evidence this time went to NASA and space engineering operatives when they, in fact, have much to explain in their role in the Kennedy assassination and in the Martin Luther King assassination also. They also had to come up with the fact that our bodies change 1 to 2 inches in height every day, and that photographic evidence taken at autopsies and passports and in the Army isn't necessarily accurate because the camera could be on a dolly which moves back and forth and changes shape. I'm not aware that these official organizations use dollies even to get a driver's license. There's a set camera and a set place to stand. On the other side of this tape, we'll do some more about the gross errors of the House Select Committee. Good evening. This is Mae Brussell, Carmel, California. This is tape number 356, side 2, September 29th, 1978. While I'm directing my attention to the tapes for the next few weeks on the House Select Committee on Assassinations and their cover-up, I do have to take time out once in a while for important news events. And I want to reiterate the importance of the John Kennedy assassination as the source of a coup in this country, and what followed afterwards would escalate in violence and terror if we didn't solve that particular problem. And all of my research, of course, mounted and became more and more complicated as the links to the Kennedy assassination became more evident. On my tape, cassette number 354, side 1, on Evil Younger, that just went out 2 weeks ago, there is a section there about Ken Reitz, the campaign manager for Evil Younger, and his work with Congressman Mills. On that one sheet I misspelled it. It's M-I-L-L-S. I just mistyped it. I know the difference. And the death of Congressman Mills at the time of his political campaign in Maryland, and you have to get the tape if you don't have it and listen to it, and the campaign managers of his that died. And Ken Reitz, I believe, should be prosecuted for his Watergate shenanigans and was moved to California to manage 2 campaigns. One, I just mentioned Evil Younger here because I was particularly detailing Evil Younger. But Ken Reitz, working along with Evil Younger, is managing the campaign of a man named Mike Kerb, who's running against Mervyn Dimely. Dimely is a Democrat. He's the incumbent, and he's a black politician who would replace the governor if there were an assassination in this state. It's an important job to run as the assistant right under the governor, which is what the campaign is about. And Ken Reitz is managing that campaign. Well, just this week in San Diego, 2 planes collided. Possibly 3 were involved, or even 4th. That Boeing 727 collided head-on with a small plane flown by a student pilot in San Diego, which is described as America's worst air disaster. And in all of the conspiracy cases or possible conspiracy cases, the evidence is always controversial. It doesn't fit. It's not a clear-cut case. And when they ask one question, they get more answers, and the answers are confusing. And as soon as this plane crashed, I began, of course, to collect articles and other friends of mine to send to me to see who was on the plane. The next day, there was an article in the newspaper that 2 people who canceled their flight on Flight 182 were Lieutenant Governor Mervyn Dimely, the Democrat running against Mike Kerb, and a San Diego Gas and Electric Company lobbyist who decided they wouldn't take that flight. They were scheduled for Flight 182, but at the last moment, Mervyn Dimely changed his flight. He was booked on this plane by an aide, and he was going to be in San Diego at 9:30 in the morning for a speaking engagement. But he decided to visit some friends on Sunday night and flew out of Sacramento on Sunday night and missed this flight. Now, I've called the offices of Mervyn Dimely, and I've asked them to look into 6 questions, and if they answer these 6, I'll then go on and give them some more leads. 1, who made the original reservations for Merv Donnelly down in San Diego, specifically who made them. When were they made? How long before? And where was he going? He was to speak there at 9:30 in the morning. What was the name of the group? And who was he to speak to? And the fourth question is, who canceled the reservations? That's important because if a secretary in the office canceled it and the office was bugged, the same people who knew about the arrangements would also know that he's not taking it. But if he took a plane and got to San Diego and a family member or sister or wife or friend or somebody called in and said, we're canceling the morning flight, he's here on Sunday night, then that house wouldn't necessarily be bugged. So the question is, who canceled it and when was it canceled? Was it canceled when he was in San Diego on Sunday night after he got there? And where was it canceled? Was it done in Sacramento when he left? Did he just hop a plane on Sunday without anyone having any time to know? And I think those are important. I don't mean to digress from the John Kennedy assassination, but I don't think it's far from it. The very next day after the plane crash, day after, there was a story that Mervyn Donnelly brought up against this record producer, Mike Curb, the Republican running against him, that he's involved in a pornographic movie in Los Angeles, and he sang part of the soundtrack in a voice, and that he participated in pornographic movies. He's made this charge. The movie's called The Acid Blasting Freaks, and it's about Hollywood weirdos. And his opponent was participating in that movie. Now, it may have been that somebody got information that he was going to break this story. If Merv Donnelly had been on the plane, this story would never break, linking Mike Curb to the pornographic movies. If Merv Donnelly were killed, we would have the Republican lieutenant governor in because Curb has the machine, the money, hundreds of thousands of dollars of possible campaign money, and there's no backup to take Donnelly's place who's well known. It would have been according to the King Alfred plans, getting rid of one more black leader. And then with Mike Curb in, even if Jerry Brown won as governor, he could then be assassinated, and the Republican inner team that had been linked directly to past dirty tricks that were never solved could transpire, and these positions could have been moved into power through one more accident. I might or might not have mentioned the Virginia campaign in Washington, in Virginia, not Washington, the senator against Mr. Warner, the Republican who worked with Richard Nixon and the Dirty Tricks gang, former Secretary of the Navy, and when Warner lost the primaries, his opponent was killed in a plane crash, and now Mr. Warner is running in the elections. We have a link here of Congressman Mills, who died, and Ken Reitz was responsible for the funding in his account. Two of Congressman Mills' aides are dead. Herbert Kalmbach, who worked with Ken Reitz, was a lawyer for the United Airlines, and they carefully covered up Dorothy Hunt's plane crash. So you have dirty tricks departments, you have plane crashes, election manipulation by accidents, and because Merv Donnelly was supposed to be on that airplane and canceled it, I jumped right in and gave them some questions, and I hope that some answers will follow and that they'll go. I didn't mean to digress from the John Kennedy assassination, but these things are important. And also, there's an article in the Washington Post that I cut out this morning about the Pope, that he disliked violence. He was basically peace-loving. This Pope was a very quiet, simple, if you could believe many of the stories, similar to St. Francis of Assisi, a total different kind than a fascist police state would have in Italy. And within a few number of days, the Pope died last night, and I'm sure that they'll get a much more radical conservative Pope to replace that peace-loving, quiet, simple little Pope that sneaked in for just a few days. All he had to do is to have a large drawing an audience where he proclaims peace and says he hates violence, and according to my books, that would be enough to wipe him off right there, because it is not in the best interest of those people who want to control the world to have love or peace. We had a hippie Pope for a few days, but he's gone, and back to the warfare state, business as usual. That's the way I see the world, and that's the way it always seems to line up. When a fluke of a candidate or a person gets in, whammo, he's out, and in comes the hard line again to continue the fascist roll-along that I see, and I think it's pretty bad. So back to the, going back to the House Select Committee on Assassinations now. I digress there, but we'll keep on track as much as we can in the next few weeks. Before I get back, I want to say one more thing. All of you people who have taped these hearings or who will buy the tapes or who have opinions of how they covered up what you saw that I might have seen but haven't mentioned or might not have seen, if you want to write a book with me, I'm going to write a book on the House Select Committee on assassinations. I waited while the Warren Commission did their work and studied it 15 years. I've seen the House Select Committee for 17 days in public, and now I'm ready to begin rolling my 7 or 8 books on the political assassinations in the United States, on the John Kennedy first, 5 or 6 books on that alone. And the first one will be to take this material of the House Select Committee and put it into its historical framework. So if you want to be a part of that book, just as the People's Almanac takes from all over, we'll all get credit and share the profits and try to get a book out of what the people in this country feel and think, and you can all participate with me in that book. Now, getting back to the committee, their errors, in order to deprive them of any evidence that would illustrate a committee, they pulled another trick, which was even worse than the first committee that didn't call the right witnesses or didn't ask the right questions. This time, when there were allegations of the critics that E. Howard Hunt was in Dallas in 1963, November 22nd, or that Frank Sturgis was at Dealey Plaza, known as the famous tramp pictures, they didn't call those men in to testify. They could have put them on the stand publicly and had them testify, but they didn't do that. They called in an anthropologist to measure their heads and faces to say that they weren't in Dallas. Now, this has to be the biggest bullshit shenanigans, pardon my language, but I mean, it's outrageous. They had Billy Lovelady allegedly standing in the front of the Texas School Book Depository, which he says he did, but his clothing didn't match what he was supposed to be wearing, what he said he had on, and Lee Harvey Oswald's clothing were similar to the picture in the Texas School Book Depository entry. But instead of calling Mr. Lovelady as a witness, or Frank Sturgis, or E. Howard Hunt, and putting them under oath for fear of embarrassing these CIA agents, Hunt and Sturgis, they called an anthropologist to do a study of their head. And even with that, they had to say that E. Howard Hunt had had ear surgery. He hasn't responded in the media whether or not his ears are sewed back or not, but they had him having earlier head surgery on his ear to cover that one up, and depriving us of the first source of information of witnesses. They didn't call Lovelady or Sturgis or Hunt. They also didn't produce the original photograph of the back of John Kennedy's head. Now, the back of the head and the hairline with a hole is not disgusting. There's nothing morbid about it. We see it every day in the paper. We see it every night on television. John Kennedy isn't any more important than any other single person in the world. But they spent $10,000 or more to have a woman write a drawing of where the hole was and then changing the hole 4 inches. So we didn't get the benefit of this evidence of the original photograph of the head. They deprive us of that and spend $10,000 to have a drawing of the head. And that $10,000 that they spent that woman to draw the hole in John Kennedy's head with each hairline in there that she had to do minutely, every little hair on that head, they could have spent that money to invite the major critics or the critics to Washington, D.C. to explain what books they read, what documents they had from the National Archives, who they think killed John Kennedy or Martin Luther King, why we think it, what our information is based on, and then let them go after that information. Instead, they ignored every single one of the major critics, and they called in a few of them in November last year. Robert Blakey did, Sylvia Marr and Mark Blaine, I think Harold Weisberg. They called in about 6 critics, and I really have to laugh because in all of their work and public hearings and otherwise, they then proceeded to ignore everything the major critics said, even though they had publishers and books distributed in the United States and around the world. They used the National Enquirer as the only source of information that they cited, and that evidence was published by a man who was formerly with the CIA. And we'll go into that Castro story. So instead of using critics who had also used scientific evidence and documents and logical explanations and good leads of what happened in the killing of John Kennedy or Officer Tippit or Lee Harvey Oswald, they bypassed them all and went to the National Enquirer. That makes me laugh because many of the critics criticized me for putting articles in Midnight Magazine instead of getting out books in the established press, the so-called established press, and yet the critics, Robert Sam Manson and Harold Weisberg, Penn Jones, all the other critics were completely ignored, and those that have books, Mr. Rothman's book on the assassination and Accessories After the Fact, as I say, Sylvia Maher's book, all of these books were put aside and they went to the National Enquirer. So I suppose writing for the Midnight is as accurate as the Enquirer, because the House Select Committee seemed to rely more on a piece of evidence, an article from the National Enquirer, than the sum total of information that the critics provided with them. The thrust of the House Select Committee work, the main body of it, is relying upon four things for their report to support why they had to be in existence and to cover up the real facts of the assassinations. Number one, they keep referring to that Hosty letter. That's the letter that Oswald allegedly took to FBI agent Hosty that I've mentioned before, and the reprimand of 17 FBI agents afterwards, and still implying that Lee Harvey Oswald had the capability to be violent, that he might have killed the president because they knew he had this capability, and the Hosty letter plays an important part of these hearings. The second important part is the withholding from the committee the fact that the CIA worked with the mafia on plans to kill Fidel Castro. They go into this over and over again, and they say that the critics have brought this up. The only critic who brought that up was Jack Anderson in an article that the bullets that killed John Kennedy might have boomeranged because Robert Kennedy and the CIA and the Justice Department were planning to kill Fidel Castro, and he retaliated on Robert's brother. They rely on the Hosty letter and the plans to kill Castro, that he might have in vengeance come back to John Kennedy. The third thing they relied upon is that we are better than the Warren Commission because they didn't have the advantage of scientific evidence and methods 15 years ago, that we're in a new age. We're in the moon age, the space age, the great electronic age where we can do wonderful things with photographic tests and neutron tests, and sociologists and photographic analysis and handwriting and so forth, that we have the advantage now to apply this to the past work the Warren Commission did, and therefore we can confirm the Warren Conclusions findings, but the bulk of the critics' work was based on the fact that they didn't have this hard evidence. Now that is emphasized over and over through the hearings. And the fourth thing is point that is emphasized is that we may never know the answer to these questions because it's too late. The memories have elapsed. The witnesses are dying off. This is our last chance to know. They don't bring out the fact that they could call people. As I mentioned, the criticism I make is that they don't call the right witnesses on the stand. E. Howard Hunt is alive. Richard Helms wasn't asked the right questions. Gerald Ford and John Cooper and J. Lee Rankin and John McCloy are still alive and were asked the wrong questions. James Angleton is alive. Frank Sturgis is alive. And Marina Oswald was there and wasn't asked the right questions. Ruth Payne is alive. Robert Mayu is alive. Jean de Mohrenschildt. These widows are alive, Payne, Oswald, Jean, and they're not asked the right questions. But the format is go into the Hosty letter and the FBI goofed, go into the Dulles withholding of their assassination plans to kill Fidel Castro, use new scientific evidence, and then say that the memory is fading and too many people have died. So much for that. The effort of this committee, the game plan, was to take the general work that the critics had done, and I'm glad it didn't include any of my work, because even though I've published articles in The Realist and in Midnight and Playgirl and various magazines, I am not among the, in quotes, established critics, because I didn't meet with a book that they could knock down. Now, there's about 200 writers already that are critical of the Warren Commission report, but I wasn't among those. But the essence of the established critics' work that they had to knock out by the efforts that I've mentioned in the beginning, the methods that they used, they had to knock out the fact that John Kennedy's head would be forced backwards by a bullet from the front. They had to make it come from a shot in the back. They had to prove that the trajectory of the famous bullet 399 could, in fact, go through John Kennedy, John Connally, and end up pristine. They had to show that Lee Harvey Oswald did hold a rifle and picture and that his head was not superimposed. He claimed he was a patsy. They refuted in their half-assed scientific way that any puff of smoke was seen on Dealey Plaza. They had to reaffirm Lee Harvey Oswald's motive that he wanted to be famous. They had to keep repeating that Lee Harvey Oswald shot a Major General Walker in April of 1963, even though the Warren Commission ballistics experts and their own panel of experts couldn't come to this conclusion. They had to reiterate this. They had to reinforce the fact that there were no doubles of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union or in Mexico or in the United States, even though there were different heights and weights and shapes and pictures, that this, in fact, was only one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, who did all these things. They had to pull the story that the bullet fragments from John Conley came from no other bullet than a pristine bullet number 399. They did all this in 17 days. They had to show that the bullets that went through John Kennedy came from bullet 399 and no other bullet. They had to disprove that E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis were at Dealey Plaza. And even though they had Fred Grissom possibly in Dealey Plaza, and the anthropologists couldn't deny that he wasn't there, and they could link him to New Orleans and to the Defense Intelligence Agencies and the CIA and the right-wing movements, they just... So what? They had to get Hunt and Sturgis out of Dealey Plaza. They had to show that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't in the front of the Texas School Book Depository building, or else he couldn't have killed John Kennedy. This committee had to prove within 17 days that there were remarks made in the Cuban agency in Mexico that could have gone back to Fidel Castro of the plans to kill Fidel Castro, or even to kill John Kennedy while he was in that agency. These pieces of information might have leaked. They had to prove that Jack Ruby's confessions to the Warren Commission that he pleaded to tell were only based on his fears that Jews were going to be persecuted and that he was responsible for them being shifted through the Dallas-Fort Worth area to be wiped out. And they had to also prove rifle capability of Lee Harvey Oswald, that he could do all these shots in 1.6 seconds, and that the umbrella man, in fact, was just a caricature who collected a lot of umbrellas and was playing a trick on John Kennedy. And they had to fit all of this information into 17 days of hearings and put the major arguments of the Warren Commission critics publicly exposed and made fun of for all time. The trajectory, the capability of the rifle, the Oswald doubles, and so forth. Everything had to be tucked into this neat little package by Robert Blakey so that, as I say, our polls would be changed. And 80% of the country would now believe that the Warren Commission did a good job. In the book that I will be writing, and I'm going to start it as soon as the hearings are over on Reverend Martin Luther King, after the first of the year, I'll take every single one of the points that they brought up just at the public hearings alone, because people can relate to that, and we don't know what went on in the private hearings for a year, and knock each one of them out one by one based upon what they left out, what they altered, what they ignored, on the perjured testimony, the refusal to examine what the critics said, and show how this committee has centered its refutation of the critics and continued its story about Lee Harvey Oswald being guilty for the consumption of the American people. I might add that in the People's Almanac number 2, the section that has my article for them, or my writing for them, is followed by predictions of George Orwell for 1984, and it takes each, or the major predictions of Orwell, and then underneath it has where we are now. And, of course, it goes into the rewriting of history and changing history to the convenience of those people in power. And I might say that that is the purpose of doing this research, is to get our history back to us as it's being deprived. And I just can't reiterate that enough, that we have to get our history back in our own hands and get these truths out, and just keep fighting and fighting. When these liars come up like they're doing now, I don't care how much money and time they spend, we have to divert that much time and energy to stopping them and fighting them with every means possible. Even if you lose a little sleep or a few postage stamps or whatever it takes, it's very important to preserve these facts for all generations. And while these tapes take a lot of time and effort and bookkeeping, and I really get nothing for them, whatever check is sent in, I pass to the tape center. So I'm investing my own money into the printed sheets that go out. I'm not even charging for those. I'm donating those and going in the hole every month as far as that information goes. I really feel dedicated enough that the history that these tapes have are reaching enough people, and hopefully you people are making tapes for other people, and you're encouraging other people to make tapes. There's no copyright, no fees involved, and many of you do this, and you can send them to public officials, you can send them to radio talk shows. I did a 3-hour show in New York with Bill Miller right after the House Select Committee started their work on John Kennedy, and we did another 3 hours and covered 30 states, and he got my name because somebody had sent him a tape cassette of one of my shows. And it's just that kind of way of spreading information that is really important, and various radio shows have been calling around the country. And you can send to these people tapes of these shows and get dialogue going about the House Select Committee. Now that I've run down really quickly the techniques they use for the cover-up, and I won't repeat those again because you'll all have this tape, I will be going on to the major errors, the most gross errors of the House Select Committee on Assassinations in coming to their preconceived ideas and their manipulation of the evidence and the witnesses through this entire procedure. Of course, the most gross error has to be the fact that they never started to investigate whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin, or if he was guilty. Lee Harvey Oswald said, "I'm a patsy," going through the corridors at the time of his press conference the evening after, the same evening he was arrested, or in the early morning hours. The tip-off for his rifle came from another state in the South. That was written in Seth Cantor's book. Volume 20 of the Warren Commission hearings, page 376. In North Carolina, a minister called and said Lee Harvey Oswald bought a mail-order gun from Klein's in Chicago. And the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald said he was a patsy, it would be nice to know who the minister was that made the telephone call that tipped them off to the mail-order gun in Chicago. And also another tip-off that's mentioned in the People's Almanac was the fact that the first call about Lee Harvey Oswald having been to Russia and working at the Texas School Book Depository came from a gentleman working at Bell Aerospace, the same place that Michael Payne was working, and he called the police and said Oswald was working at the Texas School Book Depository. They never established, this group, the order of the tip-off of who called and how somebody would know where his rifle came from. They never established that he, in fact, wrote Alec Heidel. They said they couldn't because they didn't have the original slip, or the fact that Marina Oswald could order the rifle. They never went into the fact that the federal agents destroyed the postal slip in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that would tell where the rifle came from, even though there's a law that says it should remain for 2 years in the post office, to see who, in fact, did receive the Alec Heidel rifle. Nor did they examine or question Marina Oswald on the stand of using the name Heidel. Now, she admitted that she could have written some incriminating evidence on the back of a picture that George de Mohrenschildt had with a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald with the rifle and the pistol in communist literature, making him a notorious goer, a political assassin. She wrote some silly sayings and then ended it, ha, 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 and Marina Oswald said, "This sounds like something I could have written." I don't believe it sounds like her. It sounds more like the famous diaries that are left everywhere. There was no eyewitness that ever found Lee Harvey Oswald on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, but there were very reliable witnesses that saw him having a Coca-Cola downstairs on the 2nd floor lunchroom when the police entered the building. The palm prints on the rifle were negative. The correspondence with the FBI I have here where they questioned Lieutenant Day taking a lift. 6 days later, the rifle was examined and had no evidence of that in the Washington FBI offices. The hair and fibers on the rifle were negative as to any male. They said any male could have had hairs and fibers. They weren't distinguished as belonging to Lee Harvey Oswald. The fingerprints on the rifle were negative. He never was seen entering the building. The Texas School Book Depository had many employees. He was never seen entering with a rifle that day, assembled or disassembled, and Mr. Frazier, who took him to work, said that what he had in a paper bag was too small to be a rifle, even if it were taken apart. So he was never seen by any single person with a rifle. Someone was using his name, involving him in a rifle ownership, as I said before, at the gun shop, at the rifle range. They were also using his name in the barber shop, at a car agency. The CIA has tape-recorded voices at the embassy that they will not say are Lee Harvey Oswald. A rifle was in the possession of Ruth Payne and Marina Oswald in April of '63 when Lee Harvey Oswald was in New Orleans, and they exchanged it with a man in the area who then went on to work for the Dallas Police Department. They never went into the account of the Chicago plans to kill John Kennedy that happened just the weekend that Diem was murdered in Southeast Asia and his trip was canceled. And the man named Oswald was involved in those plans, who was going to use a car and make a getaway. They talked about the Miami plans. Mr. Joseph Miltier's evidence that he gave the Warren Commission that a rifle with a scope was to be used, but a patsy would be set up, and these plans to kill John Kennedy were made 3 weeks before the assassination in Texas. Again, the use of a scope there, the suggestion of a patsy, but if they'd gone this body to the Chicago plans, it would have gone far from a Fidel Castro vengeance plot, because he can't control Miami, Chicago, Dallas, the Warren Commission, the FBI, and federal agencies the way they were controlled. There was no evidence to link him ballistically to the shooting of General Walker. There were discrepancies in the bullets, and the Tippit murder as against the gun that Lee Harvey Oswald had, as I said before. And then there was the minutes of the meetings to cremate this body and get rid of it. So the Lee Harvey Oswald was never a question. Oswald, as the assassin, was never in Robert Blakey's mind or any member of this committee, staff, the panel, the bunch of idiots whose names I have given you, always assumed that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin. And the only piece of evidence, the only shred of evidence to link him to the assassination was that woman known as Marina Oswald. Now, next week, because the tape is running out and I wanted to go at length into the processes by which this committee worked, we'll go right into Marina Oswald, because she is the only link of Lee Harvey Oswald to a weapon, and I'll detail the role she played and the information that this committee refused to use. If you have information, as I say, and you want to add to what I have or to give me your opinions, I'll put it in and we can all co-author this book together. In the meantime, write to the House Select Committee. Tell them you're anxiously waiting for the November hearings on Martin Luther King, and we'll give them the same critical analysis.